Hello and welcome back to What Just Happened. I'm Samuel McVicar, and today I'm joined by Inigo Camilleri, an intelligence analyst on our Latin America desk here at Sibylline. Inigo is going to hopefully help us unpack what has been a pretty contentious election cycle in Peru. So, Inigo, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you. Yeah, it's nice to be here. And yeah, there's a lot to unpack.
So, Inigo, just set the context for us. What actually happened during the elections that just happened a couple weeks ago? Headlines coming out of Peru are pretty chaotic. We've got a delayed vote count, allegations of fraud, protests. Take us through the events of the election day itself.
So in Peru, to be elected president, you need at least 50% of the vote. However, the elections were highly fragmented. 36 parties participated in the election. And the leading candidate currently is Keiko Fujimori with 17% of the vote, followed by Roberto Sanchez with approximately 12.01% of the vote, followed by Rafael López Aliaga with 11.92% of the vote. So as you can see, it was quite close. The main issue stemmed from delays, but they were mostly logistical delays focused in Lima and other areas, but also in Lima mostly. And these delays affected indirectly Aliaga because Aliaga was the former mayor of Lima, and a significant part of his votes is concentrated there. What happened was that Aliaga on election night, despite being in the runner position, at the time he was second, currently he's third, he started accusing the organizational office for the elections, the ONPE, of inefficiencies and irregularities, hinting that some type of malpractice had been conducted. However, no evidence was provided, and the European Union actually ratified the elections. So nothing has come of that. However, Aliaga has sustained this narrative, and he actually, as you said, conducted a protest in front of another electoral body. And despite holding the demonstration, Aliaga's narrative hasn't been supported by other candidates. In fact, what we've seen is opposition candidates like Roberto Sanchez, the current runner-up. He has vowed to call for protests if the authorities decide to postpone the election, repeat it, or carry out some kind of similar policy.
Yeah, understood. So currently, we have one candidate in particular who's being quite loud about the allegation of fraud. Has provided no evidence. As you mentioned, some EU observers have themselves said there's no evidence of this. So in your desk's view, is this electoral fraud a genuine concern inside of Peru? Is it political theater? How are folks feeling on the ground, especially in Lima?
We currently assess the risk of electoral influence or I guess it's malpractice to be unlikely, mainly because, as I said, the EU observers actually ratified the election, but mostly other candidates that lost and won haven't criticized the results. Yes, there were delays, and a lot of candidates have actually accused the responsible authorities not of corruption, but of inefficiency and not being capable of conducting its job or their job properly. In fact, the head of UNPAC, Pietro Corvetto, he stepped down today on the 22nd of April after being accused of not taking responsibility for the irregularities on the actual day, which forced the elections to be postponed until Monday, 6 o'clock in Peru. Now, I don't see a risk of the results being suspended or rejected by a majority of parties. It's true that Aliaga, whether he goes through or not, I think if he goes through, the protests will reduce, but I think he will protest either way. But just like I say that, I think those protests are at the moment unlikely to increase in attendance and violence unless evidence comes out that there was some intentional malpractice or influence in the elections on the 12th of April.
So you sort of answered this earlier, but just to reiterate, the results are delayed until mid-May. Are you seeing, or is there any likelihood of significant unrest between now and when those results are officiated, would you say?
Yes, they will be delayed until mid-May, as you said. But however, I don't see any indicators at the minute showing that there will be protests or demonstrations. I think, for example, the delay of results itself could trigger some kind of protest if people perceive that the authorities are hiding or delaying anything on purpose. Again, at the minute, there haven't been any indicators of that. Precisely, we've seen the opposite. We've seen candidates call for their voters to step down and stay home and respect the results, and other opposition candidates as well, right? So at the minute, I don't see that risk being high.
Okay, so cooler heads are prevailing for now, contingent on whether or not some new development occurs, in which case it could go sideways, and I'm sure we'll get you back on. Now, interestingly, when I was reading your desk reporting, I saw a note in there about how Peru has had 7 presidents in the last 9 years, which is a lot, unless, of course, you're from the UK. How did Peru get stuck in this cycle of pretty consistent political turnover, would you say?
Since 2021, when Pedro Castillo was elected in the last formal elections, Castillo dropped in popularity quite quickly. And in 2022, he was accused of a series of corrupt activities, embezzlement, and collusion. He was officially removed from power. And his right-hand person, Dina Boluarte, was chosen to be the next president. However, Dina Boluarte was officially the least supported official president across the world, with only a 2% approval. And in October 2025, she was removed from power following a series of accusations and a sharp increase in insecurity across Peru that has affected multiple sectors, including the extractive sector and the transport sector in particular. And in her place, José Geri was chosen, to be more precise. And Geri was again accused of corrupt activities with Chinese businessmen and state contracts. And in March was removed from power. The main issue is that the instability in Peru and the quick changes of president have led to general distrust of the system by their own citizens. And the problem with that is each president has been accused of some type of corrupt activity or attempted coup. So that explains, on the one hand, why we have 36 parties in the election, and no party actually has the capacity to assemble a 50% majority in the first round. And 2, it also shows why accusations like Aliaga's of electoral malpractice and irregularities quickly gain traction and gain influence between his voters, because prior evidence in the government suggests that it remains a possibility that some type of irregularity has been committed. Again, at the moment, we assess that it's unlikely given the EU observers and what we've seen. However, it does explain the current environment and the social tensions.
As you've described, there's definitely a history of contentious and turbulent elections in the country. Now we are at a point where that could be the case again, but is unlikely. I think what is important for listeners is to understand a little bit why this election for this country is so important. So let's zoom out a bit and just look at it at a regional level. So something you're reporting points out is security is a big issue in this election. Peru has just declared a state of emergency along its borders with Brazil, Bolivia, and Ecuador, I believe. So, two-pronged question here. One, how are Peru's neighbors viewing this election? And two, do you see a serious risk of regional spillover in the future?
So to answer that question, first I need to provide the context on security in Peru and the ongoing crisis. Since 2021, extortion has increased by 500%. And although it's prevalent across the country, it mainly affects the departments of La Libertad and the capital Lima. And primarily it targets the transport sector, the retail sector, and also the hospitality sector. However, those targets tend to remain small-scale businesses rather than large enterprises or multinationals. And the main issue with extortion and homicide is that the authorities have been unable to stop them. In fact, gangs have been able to infiltrate the security forces, both the police and the military. And the authorities, although they haven't adopted a state of emergency in a while, given the electoral process, they have previously adopted them regularly in the past across either the entire country or specific departments, and it's done little to mitigate the increase in homicides. Another aspect we need to keep in mind is the nature of organized crime groups in Peru. They are quite fragmented, and as you said before, this taps a bit on the regional scale. Unlike Ecuador, Colombia, or Brazil, Peru has a large number, hundreds, of small gangs and organizations that tend to operate within specific regions, routes, or even districts in Lima. These gangs haven't shown yet any sign of sophistication in terms of cooperating with large groups in Colombia or cartels in Mexico. However, the data suggests that any continued growth will lead them to cooperate further with external groups, and that would in turn increase fiscal security risks across Peru, specifically across artisanal mining areas, across Lima, and major urban areas. In Ecuador, President Daniel Noboa has recently issued states of emergency across border provinces and other kind of provinces with the presence of organized crime groups. In Brazil, the PCC, the First Capital Command, and the Red Command, the CV, both have a nationwide presence, including in border states that border with Peru. And Bolivia, again, remains a major transiting country for drug trafficking routes and networks. So Peru becomes a central hub that connects a lot of different countries, first of all. Second of all, it remains a cocaine producer, although not as major as Colombia. It's still a cocaine producer. And while that's focused in the Amazon or jungle areas of Peru, they still pose a risk as they attract networks. For example, not just with cocaine, but with illegal mining. Illegal mining is highly profitable in Peru. Illegal gold mining, in particular in the northern areas. We've seen Ecuadorian OCGs, organized crime groups, enter Peru to provide security to illegal mining groups that were stealing from local deposits or reserves or large operations run by companies. And one thing I should add on illegal mining is that it primarily affects informal mining. Informal mining and illegal mining are tied because of the current system that the Peruvian government has issued since 2016 to control and monitor the large number of artisanal and small-scale miners across Peru. They established the REINFO, the Informal Mining Registry, which essentially was a platform for informal miners to register and obtain resources from the government in exchange for slowly start their formalization process and enter the system. However, the issue is that a lot of informal miners had initially not committed crimes, but hadn't kept within the law in a lot of informal activities and mining. So the info included some clauses that provided immunity to miners that joined the registry, immunity for mining-related activities. That provided a legal umbrella for illegal mining groups to cooperate with informal miners or simply infiltrate Reinfo and essentially carry out illegal mining activities. But according to the law and the eyes of the authorities, they remain legal. So, given the nature of organized crime groups in Peru, regional countries haven't increased pressure on the Peruvian government to crack down on illicit networks. And, for example, the US hasn't increased pressure either on Peru to crack down on groups. In fact, they've increased pressure, but mostly on a commercial basis, which we can get to that in a second.
Yeah, let's talk about the US. So traditionally, the US has paid attention to political instability in Latin America, especially where organized crime and migration risks are involved. Why hasn't Washington focused more attention on Peru? Does your desk see that as a possibility in the future?
Definitely, yes. I think Peru's becoming one of the major security players in terms of gangs and rising crime in the region. It's still not up there with Ecuador, for example, or Colombia or Mexico. However, it's becoming an increasingly strategic player. The extortion networks and the drug trafficking networks and the illegal mining networks are providing a reason for groups to potentially expand. Again, we haven't seen that yet. So it's a mix of that and also a bit of a comparison. If the US gets involved within Latin American affairs in security matters, as we've seen, they're more likely to do it in Ecuador, given the ongoing crisis and the actual presence of large-scale groups which cooperate with the Jalisco cartel in Mexico, or the Sinaloa one in Mexico too, right? And we've also seen cooperation between the US and Mexico. So we have seen that cooperation. We haven't seen it yet in Peru. What we have seen is pressure on Peru against the Chancay port. Now, this is a big strategic port and a point in Peru because it's owned and built by Chinese state-owned companies. And the US is attempting, obviously, to remove Chinese presence in the region, both in security affairs and commercial affairs. And what the US has done has been to provide funds to expand local ports in Callao, which serve both as a strategic point for security and commerce. So again, we are more likely at the minute to see that type of competition between the US and China in Peru through a soft power approach more than a hard power one, where we see any security force cooperate with the US on actual soil in Peru. Again, this could potentially change in the long term. This is all obviously in the long term. We still have the current scenario of the elections and the instability. In the event that Keiko takes power in the runoff election, we will likely see heightened cooperation. And with Aliaga, a similar scenario is likely. However, with Roberto Sanchez, for example, more of a left-wing candidate, the cooperation might be more limited in that sense, and he might follow a different type of approach instead of an increased crackdown and patrolling across gang hotspots and crime hotspots.
Yeah, so you touched on a couple interesting things there. So the Chinese are investing into Peru. The Americans are investing. So that touches on kind of an economic angle. Peru, as I understand it, and I believe your reporting points out, has historically been one of Latin America's more stable economies. So this political instability rising crime and extortion, as you've laid out. Does your desk see this as damaging that investor confidence? How are both of these two things impacting everyday economic life in Peru, would you say?
At the minute, I don't think it has, although it has raised concerns for long-term impacts. As I said earlier, crime in Peru remains fragmented and there's hundreds of gangs operating across the country. We haven't seen any significant increase in the targeting of foreign companies. However, we have seen issues of illegal mining groups entering large mines and kidnapping members, killing miners, or simply stealing material. So there's obviously a physical security risk, to disrupt overland supply chains and transit routes. However, again, companies continue to operate and the investor confidence hasn't reduced yet. Partly also due to the regional impact of insecurity in Peru. As I said earlier, it's not as large as in Ecuador or Colombia, so companies are able to sustain operations. However, that scenario could possibly change in the long term once a candidate is elected as the president. Both Aliaga and Fujimori aim to reduce hurdles to investment to facilitate private sector investment. However, for example, Roberto Sanchez, he has publicly praised Pedro Castillo. He stands more on a left-wing platform, and Pedro Castillo previously issued some type of limitations on operational licenses for businesses. So there is a possibility that if Sanchez is elected, investor confidence could possibly reduce. However, that would still happen in the long term. At the minute, investor confidence will be sustained as it is, and it won't be affected.
Last question then for you, Inigo. Looking ahead, what is your desk looking for in terms of triggers, warnings, indicators?
So I think protests and call for demonstrations are a good indicator, which, as I mentioned earlier, an indicator for that is any large accusations of corruption, or perhaps indicators that some type of irregularity has taken place beyond the delays that we spoke about earlier. More indicators, for example, could be large-scale attacks, which at the moment remain unlikely. These don't take place often in Peru. They have taken place occasionally in the past. However, they tend to target transport sector businesses, hospitality businesses, or public offices in Trujillo, for example, in La Libertad, with explosives. But again, these tend to be quite focused instead of looking to cause a large number of casualties. And other indicators are any foreign body, such as the EU, the UN, elevating concerns that the ongoing delays perhaps indicate something beyond any kind of bad luck or bad organizational approach in the elections on the 12th of April, right? And another last indicator that I should mention is any significant policy changes leading to reinfo. Interestingly, neither Fujimori nor Aliaga included any policies on reinfo within their manifestos. And both parties have previously been accused of cooperating and being favorable towards informal miners and reinfo. Therefore, any significant policy change in reinfo that possibly terminates any formalization process and ends any kind of representation from the state to informal miners could potentially push for protests or demonstrations across Lima or major transit routes, as we have seen them in the past, which include roadblocks and clashes with security forces personnel.
Well, that's really interesting. Thank you very much, Inigo, for taking the time, and we'll definitely ask you to come back on if or when these results are officiated. Hopefully it goes off without a hitch, of course. And thank you to our listeners for joining. Please do subscribe to our mailing list. There you will just receive updates whenever we release a new episode on any of our podcast channels. We have 2 others. So check that out. Links are in the description down below. And until next time, please take care.